Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream of History by Podcast. And today I'm joined by Ross Nichols. He's the author of the Moses Scroll. And I'll have a link in the description below to the History Valley Amazon affiliate link so you can go get his book. That being said, welcome back to the podcast, Ross.
Hey, Jacob, good to be back. I was looking forward to it for the past couple of weeks since you invited me back on, so I appreciate it, man.
Yeah, likewise. You want to tell everybody where they can find your YouTube channel real quick before we get started?
Yeah, it's very easy, Ross K. Nichols TV. So you can find us on YouTube. That's our channel. And if you like what you hear tonight, there's probably going to be more of it there. And we've got quite a bit going on there. My son and I are working together to bring some good quality content. And so please subscribe, Ross K. Nichols TV.
Great. Can you give us a brief recap on what the Moses Scroll is before we continue, in case anybody hasn't seen our previous episodes or haven't heard of you at all or your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Jacob, I think we've done two classes before. The first one we did was just sort of an overview of the Moses Scroll, which is the title of my book. I've called a certain scroll the Moses Scroll. It's a scroll that was, or actually technically and more accurately, I could say there were 16 leather strips purportedly discovered east of the Dead Sea in a cave high up in the Wadi Mujib in the middle of 1865. These 16 leather strips, written on leather in Paleo-Hebrew in what is called scriptio continua, continuous script with no breaks except in certain places where there were interpuncts or words separating dots. These 16 leather fragments came into the possession of a dealer, an antiquities dealer and shop owner by the name of Moses Wilhelm Shapira in 1878. I won't go through the story of why it took that long for him to come in possession of those, but he sent a letter and a partial transcription to a scholar by the name of Schlotman, a German scholar by the name of Constantine Schlotman at Halle in Germany, and he said, hey, check this out. I believe this is an ancient and authentic manuscript. Constantine Schlotman was also friends and colleagues with a person that many people know, Franz Delitzsch, another German scholar, very well respected. They both looked at this manuscript. They were very critical of it, sent a letter back within a short period of time, told Moses Shapira, this is fake, leave this thing, don't bring this thing around, don't want to hear anything else about it, case closed. And so Shapira put it in a bank vault in the Bergheim Bank in Jerusalem at the time. This is 1878, and he left it there. But then he read, sometime we think around the spring of 1882, a German book written by a scholar by the name of Friedrich Bleek. And Bleek is one of the critical historical scholars from the time. This book was written in 1860. And when he read this work, he said, you know, I think that maybe that manuscript might be real. Now, stick with me. I'll define real by ancient and authentic, so we'll get into the details of that. But he becomes convinced that by studying the critical academic scholarship of the time, that this could very well be an ancient document. So he pulls it back out. He shares the manuscript, meaning he shows it to a couple of other guys, other biblical scholars, and I've written about this in the book. They're very well-respected scholars, and initially they believed that it too was authentic. So this manuscript, now we're talking 83, May of 1883. This is the Reader's Digest version, by the way. So in May the 9th of 1883, Shapira writes a letter to another scholar in Germany by the name of Hermann Strack. And he tells Strack, he said, you got to see this. It's about a 10, 11-page letter he writes to Strack, and he describes how he came to possess it, why he believes it is ancient and authentic. He sends the letter off, and at the close of the letter, Shapira tells Strzok, I'm on my way to Germany. Well, this is an age where you have to wait a few days before a letter arrives. It's not like today where you can send an email, get instantaneous feedback. So he leaves. Meanwhile, Strzok, who is very close with the other two scholars I mentioned, Schlotman and Delitzsch, they have a little talk, and they all agree it's fake. Shapira, stay out of this. We don't want to see your fake document around here. Keep it in Jerusalem. Shapira's on his way. He goes to Germany. As I record, by the way, there are several people who have written on this. Idan Dershowitz is a friend of mine. He's a scholar. He wrote a book on this called The Valediction of Moses. Very similar in nature, except his is more of an academic approach. He also believes that this manuscript is authentic. So, kind of pulling this together, I heard about this manuscript. By the way, so the Germans, a couple of Germans, believed it was authentic. We've deciphered, translated, transcribed their personal letters. But for some reason, when their academic book was published in 1883, in August of 1883, they had decided, or Hermann Goethe, one of the Germans, had decided that it was a forgery, a cleverly put together forgery. And that book was published at that time. He then goes to Great Britain and presents it to scholars there. By the end of August 1883, going into September, everyone in the scholarly community had publicly declared this a forgery. Moses Shapira goes to the Netherlands. He's there for about 6 months. People have misinterpreted why he's there. They picture Shapira walking around almost in a drunken stupor, depressed, and the story goes that he ends up in a Rotterdam hotel where he takes his own life. Now, what we do know is that he was there for about 6 months. I discovered why he was there, and it certainly wasn't that he was depressed and wandering around, leaving bags and things in shady hotels. He's actually staying in new hotels. All these myths need to be shot down, but historians sometimes get pretty sloppy, and they don't do the research. So, I come in contact with the story, get excited about it, because what I realize is that few people had actually looked at the text of the manuscript. Remember, before Idan Dershowitz published his book came out 2 weeks after mine. There was no critical academic study of the text of the manuscript. I had two scholars, Menachem Mansour from Wisconsin, who in the 50s brought this story back to the academic world. And then I had a book called The Shapira Affair by John Marco Allegro. Both of these scholars actually believed that it was authentic and ancient, as did Teicher, as did Helen Jefferson. So I'm reading these reports of these academics, and I read more of a popular book by a brilliant writer by the name of Hanan Tigay. Hanan Tigay's book, very well written. Again, he's a superb writer, but he did two things. One, he said, just like everyone else, he said it was a forgery. And the most important thing to me is that he didn't tell me what the text said. In other words, there are telltale signs. Any scholar, and I know that you have scholars who watch your show. In fact, I know one of them in the audience now. What we know academically, there are certain things we can say for certain, right? Some things we speculate, but there are telltale signs of what would be in a document if, work with me here, I'm going to give you some hypotheticals. If there is a Moses, because some people think there isn't, if this Moses is literate, because some people say he isn't, and if Moses left us some sort of record, you could almost put together what that document would say. And there are things that wouldn't be in a document that Moses wrote, and I have to tell your audience something. Some of those things, Jacob, are in the Pentateuch. So you asked me two questions about coming on this show, and the two questions, as I recall, Number one, what did Moses write? I'd like to start off with that. And the second question is, again, with my caveats that I listed at first, there is a Moses. Moses is not illiterate like some people want to paint him. What would that say? And then the next question that I think is really fun, at least fun. So maybe my scholar friends who are on can at least play. This is going to be fun. Did Jeremiah preach from the Moses scroll, meaning the document that I claim, the Shapira manuscript, or if they want me to be a little more open in that, did Jeremiah preach from an Deuteronomy text, a Deuteronomy text that is different than the one we have? And I think that I have put together a fairly convincing set of connections between what that scroll would look like and what we have in Jeremiah and in the Moses scroll. So is that kind of a good enough introduction?
Oh, I definitely thought it was. But yeah, I would like you to dive deeper into the connections between Jeremiah and the Moses scroll. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I'd like to do is, if I can build up for, I think your audience is very well read, but if I can touch on a couple of things first, like this idea of what would we expect to find in a scroll that is pre-priestly, if you will, or an early version of the text, if I can take a few minutes and just kind of hit some of those high points. So we know the fundamentalist view. The fundamentalist view is that Moses wrote the 5 books. In fact, all you need, I grew up in a good Baptist church. I was a good Baptist boy at one time, and I grew up with the King James, and most Christian Bibles will say, you open it up to the first page, Genesis, and it says the first book of Moses, called Genesis. The second book of Moses, called Exodus. Okay, so we know that that is the traditional view. In fact, traditional Jews and Christians sing from the same hymnal on that. And that's one of the few things that Jews and Christians can agree on, but they both agree, and I mean good Christians, good Jews, very religious, devout, fundamentalist Christians and Jews, will tell you that. In fact, in synagogue service, when a Torah scroll is held up and paraded around, there is a Hebrew phrase chanted, the translation of which is from Deuteronomy 4, verse 44. This is the Torah that Moses gave us, basically. And so that's the view, and we have the same view in Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers. In Pirkei Avot, we have this chain of custody. It's how we can know that we know that we know. See, Jews say that, Christians say that, and Christians in my Baptist church I grew up with, beyond a shadow of a doubt. If a Christian is listening, some of your audience may be Christian, you have also at least some evidence from the Gospels and the Christian writings, the New Testament, 27 books of the New Testament, that Moses is believed to be the author of these 5 books as well. A big example I think that you could go to is Matthew 5, 17 through 20, this idea that that not one jot or one tittle will in any wise pass, but it's talking about Moses and his 5 books. Now, before I knew anything about Shapira, because I'm going to get to that, before I knew anything, I hadn't really studied any books on the academic approach to the Hebrew Bible. I wasn't familiar with Richard Elliott Friedman. I wasn't familiar with Bleek or Wellhausen. I just loved my Bible like so many other people, and I was just reading it very, very closely, critically, very closely, let's say. And one thing that hit me one day, and this builds up to the whole story I want to tell, is that I noticed something that I had never noticed before. I had in my mind that Moses wrote the 5 books. And we meet Moses in Exodus 2. Everybody knows that. But from Exodus 2 through the end of Deuteronomy, I've counted, and I've used sophisticated software, so I'm not good at math, but I'm at least good at using software. And I found that the name Moses is used some 640 times in the 5 books that are attributed to Moses. Well, that hit me one day. That it had never hit me before, but I said, why would it say the Lord spoke unto Moses if Moses wrote this? It seems more natural to say the Lord spoke unto me. And I thought, well, that's weird. So I kept finding third-person references. So here's what we know. In the book of Exodus, the name Moses is mentioned some 300 times. In Leviticus, it's 85 times. In the book of Numbers, it's 230 times. And then in the book of Deuteronomy, it's 32 times. And you find third person all the way through the Pentateuch, except, now remember, this is before I knew anything about what academics think about the Hebrew Bible, the composition of the Pentateuch. I hadn't read Joel Baden, didn't know any of these wonderful, brilliant scholars, Kip Davis, but what I found was, okay, in Deuteronomy, there is some first-person material. So in my initial study, my pass through, I said, that is striking. It hit me for the first time, and I thought, wow, something's going on here. So that kind of launched me into a quest. And my quest was, if Moses didn't write the Torah, and that doesn't mean that he wasn't known in some circles in some form in ancient literature and ancient religion, but the composition of the Pentateuch as we have it, could it be that there was something that Moses wrote? So then I began to study all these other academic approaches. I think my first book was Richard Elliott Friedman, Who Wrote the Bible. That was a good starter book. I think fabulous. I love it. It's one of my biggest recommendations for anyone who loves the Bible like I do. I highly recommend it. Richard Elliott Friedman, Who Wrote the Bible. That led me into a world that shook my foundations, but I'm excited that I'm still on the path. So we had third-person references to Moses, which made me think that our Pentateuch was not written by Moses. Okay, so I found other things, and I learned some of this from academic approaches. One is that in Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy begins in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. I get a voice of a narrator there, and let me tell you how I know it's not Moses. Again, I grew up with the traditional, but this was one of the things I put in the column that said Moses could not have written this. It begins, these are the words which Moses spoke on the other side of the Jordan. And I said, whoa, hang on. Moses, according to the biblical text, never crossed from the east side, from Transjordan, into the land of Canaan. He is on the east side. That's where he dies. It's where he's buried and so forth. But the writer of Deuteronomy 1, I hear a narrator's voice. I see a narrator's hand. And he says this. Oh, wait a minute. I should do right to left, not left to right. But the narrator says, Moses spoke these words that I'm about to tell you on the other side of the Jordan. Now that tells me a couple of things. It says the writer of this text is on the wrong side of the Jordan to be Moses. Hopefully that makes sense. I could act it out, but I'll get out of the camera frame, so I don't want to do that. Then there's some obvious ones. Now I'd like to say that I'm just so sharp I picked up all these on my own, but I learned a lot of them from people back in the 1700s, primarily the 1900s for sure. This becomes very, very well known in the academic circles. In the 19th century, for sure, this is well known. Things that make you say, huh. For instance, Moses, if Moses wrote the Torah, Genesis 1:1 through Deuteronomy 34:12, did Moses describe his own death and the servant of the Lord died there and God buried him? Even in Jewish literature, in the Talmud, we had references. Well, one reference in the Talmud says that Moses wrote of his own death in his tears. That's the extreme fundamentalist view. But we also have other views in the text of the Talmud that say, well, Joshua wrote the final verses. But there were questions. So now this idea that Moses wrote the whole Torah is starting to look different to me, if you follow what I'm saying. We wouldn't expect the meekest man in all the earth to say, and Moses was the meekest man in all the earth. You know, it's like the old country song, "Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way." It's not something you would expect from the most humble man. So in my initial learning, I set out to determine, because it was just a good thing to do. I didn't know if anybody had ever done this. And some of the scholars on here might say this is crazy. You know, we've already looked at this. But here's what I thought. Does the Bible, do the 5 books give us a memory, if you will, or a record of what someone says Moses wrote? So I found 7 references in the Pentateuch, all third person, that said this is what Moses wrote. Very quickly, I know you won't remember this, but you can pause it later and write it down if you want it. Exodus 17, verse 4, Exodus 24, verse 4, Exodus 34, 27, Numbers 33 and verse 2, and then I'm going to get into the others. So there, it says, here's what you would expect. This was my approach. What I would expect to find, Exodus 17, 14, I would expect to find that in what Moses wrote, because it said that Moses wrote this. I thought, well, maybe somebody knows this. Exodus 24 and so forth. But I want to take just a minute, Jacob. This is a good Bible class. Hopefully everybody has a good Bible with them. If not, you have to trust me. But I'm going to use the NRSV, and I want to go to Deuteronomy 31. I'm going to get into in a minute. I know, don't think that you invited me, and I'm not going to talk about what you wanted to. But you asked me first, what did Moses write? And here's what we know. This was the way I'll start it. Deuteronomy 31, verse 9 says the following. And then Moses wrote down HaTorah Hazot, this Torah, and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. Now I'm going to go down to verse 24. I want you to hear this. This struck me hard when I first read it and really saw it. When Moses had finished writing in a book the words of HaTorah Hazot, this law, to the very end, Moses commanded the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, saying, take this book of the law, Sefer HaTorah, and put it mitzad ha'aron, beside the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God. Let it remain there as a witness, and so forth. So here's the point. If this verse, Deuteronomy 31, verses 24 through 26, has this interesting thing, it says Moses finished writing whatever is called the Torah. Remember, verse 9 said he wrote the Torah. Verse 24 through 26 says he writes it to the very end. Deuteronomy's not even over yet. We still have chapter, here we are in 31. We got 32, 33, 34. So what was that little book or scroll? Sefer is really a good translation from the Hebrew would be an account. A scroll is what we call it today. But he's written it. We don't know what form. Was it papyrus, whatever, and where would it have been? It says it's in safekeeping in the ark. So I'm going to push through this quickly, Jacob, and get into the good stuff, because I don't want to lose anybody. I want people to learn this fun stuff. So that little scroll is what I set out to find. Didn't know anything about Shapira. Never heard of Shapira. And so what I found through my study of the Hebrew Bible, and by the way, all of this is written in my book. I've got a chapter on what did Moses write. And the book, the Sefer, is called by the following names. It's called Sefer HaTorah, 10 times in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible. It's called Sefer Moshe, 8 times in the Tanakh. And it's called Sefer Torat Moshe, a scroll of the Torah of Moses, 4 times. So I worked through every one of those references, and I found something that I thought was very instructive. And that is that every one of those references pointed to a Deuteronomy-like, bear with me, a Deuteronomy-like document. It was meaning that almost without exception, the passages which referred to this little book that Moses wrote, I keep calling it book, this little scroll that Moses wrote, was described throughout the text in some 20 some odd passages, and almost without exception, it pointed me to Deuteronomy. Now, the academic world says that Deuteronomy is the last, that D, as we call it, people have heard of JEPD. I know some of your viewers may not agree with the documentary hypothesis, but let's say Deuteronomy, and for those who study documentary hypothesis, that D is last. In fact, they date it to the time of Josiah. So that brings me to something quite interesting. Now, first of all, remember that this scroll in Deuteronomy 31 is put mitzad ha'aron, put in the, I don't want to say in the side, it literally means mitzad is, I'd say next to or beside the Ark of the Covenant. The Levites who carry the Ark, specific set of Levites, are supposed to keep accurate records of this, or keep up with it. But did they keep up with it? That's the question. No, because it becomes lost. It's lost. In fact, there's an interesting Dead Sea Scroll. All Dead Sea Scrolls are interesting if you love Dead Sea Scrolls. The Damascus document has an interesting passage, and I happened to record this in my book because I thought it was pretty cool. And so I'm going to go to in my book. And what this is, you're stepping into a debate on multiple wives, right? And what do what does the author of the Damascus document think about? Should you have more than one wife? Is it authorized by God? And so this is what the question is. It says the principle of creation is this: male and female, he created them. You can see where this is going. Also, those who entered the ark went in two by two. And some of you might know that depends on which part of the story you read. And concerning the prince, the Nagid, it is written, he shall not multiply wives to himself. Now, bear with me. Here we go. But David, meaning King David, had not read the sealed book of the law, which was in the Ark of the Covenant, because it was not opened in Israel from the death of Eleazar and Joshua. What in the world are they talking about? Quickly, here's the point. If you say, look, you should only, one man, one woman, just like in the Garden of Eden, just like the 2 by 2 going on the ark, someone in that question, in that discussion would say, well, hang on just a second. What about David, a man after God's own heart? Why would he multiply wives? Now, the implication is, here you've got, what if you had Deuteronomy 17, verse 14 through 20, the Torah of the king, and it says very plainly in there that not only shall you not multiply women and horses and, you can't do any of that stuff that makes it fun to be a king. You're supposed to be just like your brothers. Well, but here David, a man after God's own heart, has multiplied women. He's got plenty of wives. And he's supposed to write a copy of the Torah, HaTorah Hazot is what it says in Deuteronomy 17. He's supposed to write that and read it every day to make sure he doesn't do this bad stuff. Well, that is a good question. Why does David multiply women? And here we have the point. What they're saying is he didn't have the sealed book of the law. So now we're coming to the cool stuff. Fast forward in time, not from the Dead Sea Scroll time, but let's say Moses wrote a small document. A Sefer Moshe was written at some point, whenever you date the Exodus. Biblically, 1 Kings 6 is going to put you around 1446. Academics are going to generally fall more 1200s. If you watch Tim Mahoney, you're going to go to the 1500s or what. But, okay, something happens. 622 BCE. 622. We're in the 18th year. We're in the 18th year of a king by the name of Josiah. He becomes king when he's 8 years old, when his father Ammon is assassinated. So in 622, he becomes king, and there is a fantastic story. In my opinion, it is one of the greatest stories in biblical literature for a lot of reasons. And here's the story. King Josiah, now by the way, the story is told in two places in the Bible. 2 Kings 22:23 and 2 Chronicles 34:35. Now, if you don't do this, some of you listen to me every week on Saturday mornings and Thursday nights. You do this. If you don't have this book, by the way, it's called A Synoptic Harmony of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles with related passages from Psalms, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezra by James D. Newsom Jr. Run and buy this book. So what I want you to do is think about the story is told in 2 Kings 22:23, 2 Chronicles 34:35 about this wonderful discovery. I'm going to propose to you, if you'll allow me, because it makes for a good story. If you don't allow me to do this, and it's not going to be fun. So let me do this. I'm going to say that in 622 BCE, a manuscript was discovered. And here's the story. King Josiah has a priest by the name of Hilkiah. Hilkiah is working in the temple, superintending, if you will, a restoration of the building. Remember, you have a lot of bad kings that came before Josiah. In fact, there are very few kings that are good at all. I mean, you can name them on one hand, and if I sit down with you long enough, your list is going to be shorter than you think it should be. But Josiah is one of the kings that's supposedly among the best. In fact, we'll get to the point we'll talk about 2 Kings 23, verse 26, 27, where it says, no king had ever arisen like him who pursued God with all his heart, all his soul, all his everything, using, by the way, Deuteronomic language. But Josiah, now here's what I want you to think about. 622 BCE, he's only 26 years old. He's a kid. I mean, he's a young man. And he dispatches this team to get the temple right because all these bad kings before him had done wicked, bad, ugly, nasty things in the house of the Lord. So he's got a team working to clean out the heavy, bad stuff, the idolatry, and get all that junk out of there. And in the process, Hilkiah, the high priest, the Kohen Hagadol, tells Shaphan, who is a scribe, translations usually say secretary, but he's a sopher. He says, look, I found the scroll. You have to look at the Hebrew here because translations boggle this up. He says, I found a scroll that Moses wrote. You found the scroll that Moses wrote. Now, okay, let's say that this scroll, if you go with a Tim Mahoney date, it's going to be about 900 years old. If this is really the scroll that Moses wrote, if you go with what academic consensus is, it's only 600. But think about this. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1946-47, you're looking at scrolls that go back about 2,000 years. So this is more than half that. So this scroll could be in pretty good shape. And so when this scroll was read, here's the story. Hilkiah says, hey, we found the scroll that Moses wrote. He reads it to Shaphan reads it. Shaphan takes it to the king, to King Josiah, and he says, look, among the other things he reported, all things are going well with the little remodel job, but here, I want you to know, Hilkiah has found the scroll that Moses wrote. And he reads it again. The question is, most fundamentalists would think that he read to him Genesis 1 through Deuteronomy 34, the end of 34. So you can imagine, you're like, King, you're not going to believe this. We found the Torah. Sit down for a minute. You need to go to the restroom first. It's going to take a while. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon. And it goes all the way through Genesis, all the way through. No. it's presented in the story. He just reads it. He reads through it, and then he leaves where he's at the temple. He goes to the monarch's, to the king's house, to palace. He reads it again. Then it's so gripping, according to the narrative in Kings and Chronicles. There are differences in the stories, but it's pretty much the same. The king, Josiah, rips his garments, and he says, you got to go take this. He gets an entourage, including Shaphan and Hilkiah, and he says, y'all go see Huldah, the prophetess. And they do. They go read to Huldah the same thing. Man, this thing, I don't think this is a very big book, because it's the little book that Moses wrote. So then the story presents a restoration that takes place, and one of the things that happens is once he begins his restoration, if you study that closely, his acts, the things that he does, one thing you're going to see is that he follows, almost without exception, Deuteronomic language. So much so that most scholars, and I think this is fair, most scholars would say that it was a Deuteronomy-like book. So here's an example. This is from Richard Elliott Friedman. Josiah's reforms are connected to instructions that are found in D. Remember, Deuteronomy, or the Deuteronomists. The narrative of Josiah making those reforms is told in terms and phrases that are typically found in D, and Josiah's reforms are traced to the promulgation of a particular scroll, which is identified by the same words as the scroll that Moses writes in D. Now, in other words, the language is the same, and I know people might look at one form or the other. I've got all of those spelled out in the book. This interlocking, Friedman continues, chain of connections led to the extremely widely held view in scholarship that the scroll that was read in Josiah's day was D. Same note is just about any other book that you would pick up in the academic world. It so matches the language of the Reformation, the restoration that took place in the days of Josiah, so matches it that scholars, particularly in the 19th century and beyond, said, this is uncanny. In fact, this is the view of the academics, not only in the 19th century, but many today would say this. Moses didn't write, they didn't find the scroll that Moses wrote. Get this. They wrote it. This is what they say. The academic world says, no. So they say that Deuteronomy, and this is a real high-level view of what academics say. Please forgive me. A lot of academics think a lot of things. But a majority, let's say, a majority of scholars interested in the Hebrew Bible would say that that the book of Deuteronomy, or D as we would call it in JEPD, that was written in the time of Josiah. So, and it was written to advance the Reformation of Josiah. So, for instance, there's one thing that happens in Deuteronomy has about 100 laws that are not found in any other book of the Pentateuch. You won't find them in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy-specific laws, laws that we wouldn't know about if we didn't have Deuteronomy. And one of those is this idea of cult centralization, that you have to do your sacrifices in Jerusalem, or it's called name theology, the place where God would put his name and so forth. So all of these different ideas suggest to some scholars that this particular scroll that was found was a form of Deuteronomy, and that was either written by the people in Josiah's court to advance their Reformation or what have you. Now, here we go. I want to ease into this Jeremiah thing. Not really ease. We're going to run into it pretty good now. So get ready, Jacob. This is what we've been looking for. Why? I guess the question is, why would Josiah send the entourage to Huldah? Because there are two more. Let me do this. There are two more prophets that are, according to the biblical text, alive and well and functioning. And those prophets are Jeremiah and Zephaniah, both of those. So we know that Jeremiah is a prophet, and not only is he a prophet, according to the rundown, if you read Jeremiah 1:1 through 1:3, it's going to tell you, these are the words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, and it says that he became a prophet. The word of the Lord first comes to him in the 13th year of Josiah. So Josiah's big reform, the discovery of the scroll, happens in the 18th year. He's been a prophet for 5 years. Now, I believe that this is evidence. I know this makes people nervous. If you're not already nervous, I don't think that Josiah knows Jeremiah. I know that Jeremiah knows Josiah because he mentions him, but he's got an overlap in the time of Josiah. Jeremiah does. His prophecy overlaps Josiah for 18 years, right? And if you look at the book of Jeremiah, this is where we're going now in our discussion, the book of Jeremiah. I'm going to suggest that Jeremiah was alive when a scroll was discovered, or the book of Jeremiah is written to say that it was. I give you that caveat for the people who are minimalist, but stick with me. So what I find striking is that when this scroll was found, it's really a fast-paced story. I'm going to suggest that Jeremiah saw this scroll. The first thing I want to say is that Kings and Chronicles say during the time of Josiah there's this great reform. The people are doing well. I can say good. They're doing good. They're doing good things. They're following. It's a revival in the land, Jacob. I mean, they've rebuilt the temple. The sacrificial cult is going on. You would think that if there's a prophet of God around, that God would tell him, hey, go tell the people how good they're doing. God's proud of them. They're following the law, and I love this group of people. But you know two people that don't know anything about a revival in the land? Jeremiah and Zephaniah. I carefully worked through. I did a 25-part series on the book of Jeremiah, and what I discovered, one of the things that anybody that reads it will see, that the book is jumbled. It is not in order at all. You've got 52 chapters, and the best way to describe it, it's almost like, imagine the writer of Jeremiah, let's say Jeremiah, has a box full of chapters, and he drops them, and the chapters get all mixed up. Now, you can fix some of it, and that's what that 25-part series was. I worked through and looked for clues. Here's something that we know. We know that Jeremiah, according to Jeremiah 1:1, first few verses, we know when his prophecies began. It began in 627 BCE, 13th year of Josiah, and it goes all the way to 587, roughly 40 years according to the introduction of that book. So, but here's the thing. That means he had 18 years when Josiah was a king, and how much of the 52 chapters talk about the time of Josiah? We only have the days of Josiah mentioned in one place in the whole book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 3 and verse 6. Now, Jeremiah chapter 3, also, later in the chapter, in verse 15, it has this strange reference about the ark is missing. But don't worry, in days to come, you won't miss it. You won't make another. You won't even It never even come to mind. Well, why is Jeremiah saying that, and why is it in the days of Josiah that is said? So now we're going to get into why I think that Jeremiah, even though Jeremiah doesn't know anything about the great revival that's supposedly going on according to Kings and Chronicles. Remember, Kings and Chronicles is the official word of the administration. I mean, they're putting out alternative facts about what's going on. But if you interview the prophets, you say, excuse me, Jeremiah, we hear that there's a great revival going on here. You see any signs of that? He'd say, I don't see a sign of that at all. In fact, I talk to God quite often, and there's nothing good going on. I mean, read Jeremiah. Even in its mixed up, it's going to say that this people is, it's bad. Okay. But here's something that's interesting. And I'm going to speculate. Some of you might say, well, you've been speculating all this time. And I'm going to go out and say this right off the bat. It is interesting to me that we know when we're introduced to Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 1, that Jeremiah is the son of a priest by the name of Hilkiah. Now, he is of the priest of a place called Anatote. Now, Anatote is very important for anyone who studies the Hebrew Bible, or if you want to understand the priesthood, it's a big, big deal. If we go back to Kings, to 1 Kings chapter 2, 26 and 27, there's this, here's what happens when David is dying. One of David's boys is trying to convince everybody he should be king, and Nathan and Solomon and Bathsheba are trying to convince David that he had at some point promised that Solomon would be king. Remember in that story. So, but what happens is Solomon wins out. He becomes king, and the priesthood of Abiathar is smacked down because Abiathar picks the wrong horse. Abiathar chooses a son of David other than Solomon, so Solomon banishes the house of Abiathar, the priesthood house of Abiathar, to Anatote. Now, that's not like sending somebody to the Siberian front. Anatote is actually a priestly Levitical town. So, it's where priests hang out. But you stay there. And what interestingly happens is that the rise of this other priesthood, Zadok, comes up at that time almost out of nowhere. And so when we study this, we realize this strange reference in Jeremiah 1 puts Jeremiah's family, Hilkiah and Jeremiah, to the priest in Anatote. But the question is, and others have proposed this as well, I want to believe, notice how I said that, Jacob, I want to believe that Jeremiah and his old man are from this priesthood, but his father's name, Hilkiah, he's the high priest. Rabbi Kimke, David Kimke, others have proposed, and I tend to like to ascribe to this, possibly that Hilkiah, the priest, who is also the father of Jeremiah, I think that could be the priest that discovers the scroll. Now, people can shoot that and say, well, that's long on speculation, short on evidence. Could be that there's two Hilkiahs. All right. Now, here's the interesting part. Jeremiah makes some comments, and the book of Jeremiah makes some comments that lets me think that he knows of a scroll that was discovered in his day, that it was discovered in his day, and he's looking at something that makes him suggest that the Bible, that the Torah they think is from God, has been manipulated. And then he sets out on a preaching tour, not like an evangelistic tour today. I mean, he's going to the temple, he's preaching in the streets, basically. Here's what he says. So here are my proofs. In 2 Kings 22:8, it talks about the scroll that was found, also 2 Chronicles 34. In Jeremiah chapter 15, 16, Jeremiah says to God, according to Jeremiah 15, 16, when your words were found, I ate them. Now, he's saying that he consumed this scroll, I believe, that was discovered in his day. Now, how can I prove that? Here's what some people might say. No, it's just a reference to him becoming a prophet. You know, in Jeremiah 1:9, it says that he sees a hand, God's hand, reach out to him and give him words. Ezekiel eats a scroll. But I think there's something very literal about Jeremiah 15. I think he's saying, when your words were found, I ate them. They became a joy to my heart. And then he begins to preach certain things. Okay. In 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 passages in Jeremiah using Deuteronomic language, it says that God set his Torah before that generation. It was set before you. The Torah was set before you, over and over and over. Then we have a couple of other things that really strike. And let me put it to you this way. I'm going to read Jeremiah chapter 7. I believe that this is an indication that the scroll that Jeremiah is referring to is a scroll different than, first of all, at least different than our Pentateuch. So go to Jeremiah chapter 7, and we're going to go to verse 21. Jeremiah 7, verse 20. I don't get out much, Jacob. They don't. So when you get to talk, all right, so jump in if you need to ask something. Jeremiah 7:21, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, NRSV translation, add your burnt offerings to your sacrifices and eat the flesh. For in the day that I brought your ancestors out of the land of Egypt, I did not speak to them or command them concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. But this command I gave them, obey my voice, I'll be your God, you should be my people, and walk only in the way that I command you, so that it may be well with you. By the way, that's Deuteronomic language there as well. They didn't obey. And by the way, also, when you see obey, generally in the Hebrew, it's related to the Hebrew Shema. They didn't listen. They didn't obey or incline their ear, but in the stubbornness of their evil will, they walked in their own counsel, looked backward rather than forward. From the day your ancestors came out of the land of Egypt, he says, I sent people and they never listened. Okay. This would be shocking because I could imagine, let's say we're alive in 622 BCE, 620, maybe 618 BC, whatever. He's preaching, and you hear this. Actually, we know the year this is preached, by the way. We'll talk about that in a minute. You would think somebody would go, hang on, Jeremiah. You telling me that God said he didn't command us sacrifices? You ever read the book of Exodus from chapter 25 on? You ever read the book of Leviticus? You ever read the book of Numbers? You telling me that God never commanded sacrifice and offering? Now, people try to nitpick this, and they try to suggest that, well, yeah, he says he didn't command them in that day. It wasn't that day. It was later in the... No, he's suggesting, Jeremiah's suggesting here, that God did not command at the time of the Exodus the sacrificial cult. Now, many scholars, and I'm one of the people who believe this, is that not that ancient people didn't sacrifice. We know that. But I believe that the sacrificial cult is a late priestly part of the Pentateuchal legislation. I think it comes in way later. So I think that this makes sense to me, that the references to the sacrificial system are later. Now, the other thing that I'd like to say about that is if you, let's just talk about Jeremiah 7 for a minute. Jeremiah 7 and 26 go together, and they both describe a a sermon, a temple sermon, let's call it. The temple sermon. In fact, a lot of notes in your Bible will say the great temple sermon of Jeremiah. It's great, all right. God sends him into basically a pit, a den of thieves, or a cave of shredders, as it's called literally in Jeremiah 7. He has to go to the in their face, in their house, in God's house, supposedly, and preach a message. Not only does he say, you put all your faith in this, Jeremiah 7, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these. He says, I'm going to destroy this house. You think you can trust this house? Go look at biblical Shiloh. It's in ruins now, where I first put my name. In Jeremiah 26, we see that the two go together. Most people believe this, I do. Jeremiah 26 says that it's at the beginning of the reign of Jehoiakim, K-I-M, Kim, who is the son of Josiah. When Josiah dies in 609 BCE on a battlefield, on the way by King Necho, he's headed up north for a fight. When he is killed, his son Jehoiakim is put in his place. And so this is the time, like right after he assumes the throne, that Jeremiah launches his ministry, basically. And so he also, he almost gets in bad, well, he does get in bad trouble. They want to kill him because he threatens to destroy the temple. The only thing that saves him is that somebody in the room, according to the story, says, hey, hold on just a second. The prophet Micah also said that God was going to destroy this place, and they didn't kill him, so we shouldn't kill Jeremiah. Remember that? Micah chapter 3, verse 18, I think. So this story is rolling along, and what I find is that right after this, Jeremiah says the following. And I'm going to give you this is probably a little bit King James-ish. And Jeremiah 8:8. Same time frame, roughly, as far as we can tell. Could even be at the temple sermon. Jeremiah says, who are we to say that we are wise and the Torah of the Lord, Jehovah, Yahweh, the Torah of Hashem is with us, when the lying pen of the scribes has made it into a lie? Now, look, people tiptoe around this all the time, particularly the fundamentalist who says, no. You have to believe that every jot and every tittle is straight from heaven through the ear of Moses and through his hand onto the scroll. That's the way they view this. And so to suggest, and in fact, you even have seen, I know people have read these books about the equidistant letter spacing in the Torah codes. You know, people want, the fundamentalist does, but Jeremiah 8, Jeremiah, could he have seen, I pose this to the viewers, could he have seen a manuscript different than what was being preached that read differently? Could. He clearly saw a document that he said the Torah has been made into a lie by lying pen of the scribes. Interestingly enough, there is another prophet, Zephaniah, I told you, who is also prophesying, preaching at the time of Josiah. Guess what he says? That the priests have done violence to the Torah. Well, I wonder what that's about. Sounds very similar to what we see in Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 8. So the question is, what was added or what was changed? What is it that would be called the lying pen of the scribes? Now, a couple of other things stand out. One of the things that I find fascinating is that, and I didn't discover this, this was found, and it was in the book by Edan Dershowitz. Edan Dershowitz wrote The Valediction of Moses. You can buy it on Amazon. It's an academic book, so it's very expensive. You know, they price those books really highly, or very high, because libraries buy them and so forth. But you can also get it on his academia page Edon Dershowitz, The Valediction of Moses. But in that book, he offers a series of what are called textual intertext. And what he proposes is that there are certain texts in the Bible which seem to point to the fact that the biblical writers knew of a scroll that matches more closely to the Moses scroll, or the Valediction of Moses, the leather manuscript strips that Shapira brought forward, than it does the Bible. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is in Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 9. And see, I can quote some of these, but I'd rather, because I know some of you are saying, I'm going to look with him. Jeremiah 7, 9. It says this, he asked, by the way, this is the sermon in the temple. This is Jeremiah's in the temple, right? So he says this, here you are. That's my Jeremiah mad voice. Trusting in deceptive words to no avail. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal and go after other gods that you've not known, and then come and stand in this house? What scholars have noticed, and Bible students for a long time, is that he starts ticking off the 10 words. You know, you've got steal, murder, commit adultery. Those, by the way, are the big three. Steal, murder, commit adultery. And I want to say this, if you look at the 10 commandments in the biblical text, we have an example in Deuteronomy 5, but we also have Exodus 20. And the two don't agree, even though if you read the text before, during, and after, it says these are the words that God spoke from the mount, from the midst of the fire, on the day of assembly, to a group of people who are assembled. By the way, Chag Sameach. It's still, I think, Shavuot, Pentecost. So this celebrated in traditional Judaism as the time of the giving of the law. But in our Bible, we have two accounts claiming to be the 10 words, and they don't agree. There's also a priestly edition in Exodus 34, which is interesting. And there's also Leviticus 19, which seems to be another version of the 10 words. But Jeremiah 7, verse 9, begins with steal, commit adultery, steal, murder, commit adultery, and then it says swear falsely. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, it does say that you're not supposed to lift God's name in vain, as it's translated, or take the name of the Lord your God in vain. But that's not what this says. The Hebrew's different. To swear falsely, the Hebrew word is shva. Shva is the word for swear, and falsely is l'shecher, for a lie, or for falsehood, to deceive, basically. Well, that doesn't appear in the 10 words. It does, however, appear in the 10 words in the Shapira manuscript. I find that to be interesting. And so what Edon Dershowitz did is he found several of these. Another I'll just give you is chapter 29 of Jeremiah again, verse 23. And there what he picks up on, Edon Dershowitz picks up on, is that it says that it's a critique of people who are committing adultery with the women or the wives of their neighbor. Adultery, wives, neighbor together appears not in the 10 words in Exodus 20 or Deuteronomy 5, but it does appear in the 10 words in the Moses scroll, the Valediction of Moses, where it uses that same arrangement. A friend of mine, Jono Vandor, also discovered another connection, intertext, in Jeremiah 32:39, where it mentions the sons after them, that exact phrase. Now, you have text in the Pentateuch and in the Hebrew Bible that says your sons after you, singular, plural, so forth. But this is only found in this verse in Jeremiah 32:39 and in the Moses scroll. What I am proposing is that not only does the scroll that Moses wrote according to the Bible. Now, some people say, well, I started with this, Jacob. Some people are going to say, I don't believe that Moses existed, and then they say, but if he did, he didn't know how to write. And if he wrote, then, I don't know, maybe he would have misspelled more words or whatever. But what the story that the Bible presents is that Moses did write a scroll sometime in the distant past. Was it in the 1200s BCE? Was it in the 1500s BCE? Are the children of Israel really the Hyksos? And I know all these different theories are out there. But the story is that he wrote a scroll, and that scroll was referred to by various terms and names associated with a Sefer Torah, Sefer Torat Moshe, a scroll of the Torah, an account of the instructions, if you will, instructions of Moses. And it seems to suggest, if you read biblical history from the time you get into Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, what you see is that the people are not obedient. It's not like you read the Bible and you go, well, most people are trying to follow the Torah. It's like they don't even know about a book, a scroll of Moses. The Dead Sea Scroll people, the writers of the Damascus document at least, as I mentioned earlier, they have a question about this too. Hey, wait a minute, why is David having more women than he's supposed to? Oh, he didn't read the scroll that was written by Moses. So the question becomes, is the possibility there? Like I said when I started, at least let's have some fun, right? Now, what I find interesting about the Moses scroll is that this document, remember when I first read the story of Shapira, one thing that I realized is that Tegay and others didn't publish the text. But what I did find, because here's what a lot of people say, Ross, you're a good storyteller, I like it. I actually get this note, and they'll say, but we don't have this Shapira manuscript. It's missing, and so even if you convince me that it's a good story, it doesn't matter. It's the provenance is all screwed up, and Shapira had a bad reputation. He was involved in Moabitica. By the way, I'm working on a book on that too. Don't be so quick on that one. There's a little bit more to the story. Like I have a file cabinet full of German documents that no one's ever seen. Let me rephrase, no one in English has ever seen. So there's more to the story there, but people have dismissed this from the get-go, and a lot of modern scholars have jumped on the bandwagon of what these earlier scholars said. They said, look, Hermann Goethe, he wrote a book on it. By the way, I published an English version of that too, called The Fragments of a Leather Manuscript containing Moses' last words to the children of Israel. But they've read the reports from the 19th century and they said, this can't be real. You know what one of their biggest criticisms was? There's no way that a leather document could survive for thousands of years in a cave by the Dead Sea. And if it could survive, why would they have sticky black stuff on the scroll? What is that? And then, if that could survive, why would there be linen? And what is it? Why does everyone report on this scroll that was discovered east of the Dead Sea, high in the cave in the Wadi Mujib? Why does everybody say it smells like asphalt? This is 1865 when the discovery happened, and 1946 scrolls were discovered in caves west of the Dead Sea at a place called Khirbet Qumran, northwest shore of the Dead Sea. You know the story. Here's the story. A Bedouin goes into a cave. There are various stories. He chasing a goat, or he threw a rock after a goat, or you pick your version. but there are variations on the story. But at the end of it, you had some Bedouin go into the cave, and what ultimately followed is the story of how over a period of about 10 years, 11 caves later, we have quite a bit of Dead Sea Scrolls on our hands. Here's a couple of other interesting points. When the scroll was discovered in and we have the reports, they're all in my book, The Moses Scroll. I went through every newspaper article I could find, every contemporary report, every academic argument back and forth, and what I found was quite interesting. And this is what made me say, what does that scroll say? Because here's what they said. Bedouin go into a cave. They find a bundle in the back of the cave. They get excited. They open up the bundle expecting to find treasure. And when they open it, they're disappointed because all they found was some black documents smelling of asphalt with a sticky black gelatinous substance on the back with pieces of linen garment stuck to it. Now let me tell you, the things that they found, to our knowledge, were unknown. It was 80 some odd years between the discovery of the 16 leather strips in the cave east of the Jordan. 80 years later, it was discovered in Cave 1 was discovered by the Bedouin tribes there. A lot of similarities. So here's the other thing that a lot of people don't know this. In the 19th century, if you were to ask the scholars, you said, look, you ever have any scrolls that say, what are you talking? We don't know. We don't have scrolls that are old. There were no ancient scrolls in 1865 through 1883. It just didn't exist. But also, they had never seen, from my research, they had never seen a Paleo-Hebrew used on leather. Like they would expect to find it on lapidary. In fact, in 1868, August 19th, 1868, the Moabite, the Mesha stone was discovered. Now, it had paleo, and I can get into that a little bit too, but I'll keep on track here. And then the Salom inscription was discovered June 22nd is when the notification went out, last part of June, coming up on that anniversary. But the Salom inscription was discovered, and there you find Paleo-Hebrew as well. But they hadn't seen it on leather. So some of the detractors in the 19th century, and sadly, I see modern scholars who just are too lazy or just didn't do the homework, in my view. Sorry. But they say some of the same stories. But they didn't know in 18... So I forgive an 1883 scholar, but here's what they didn't know was that they also said, you know what? Whoever forged this had an example. They knew about the Moabite stone, so not only did they use paleo and the alphabet, the letter forms are very similar to what we find on the Mesha stone, the Moabite stela. By the way, not true. There are several letters that are different, and if you were going to copy off the Moabite stone, they missed the mark. But be that as it may, on the Moabite stone, between each word is what is called an interpunct, or a word separating dot. Never had that been seen on leather. Now, whenever the scroll came forward, Gutta and Meyer, there were two scholars, Gutta and Meyer worked together in Leipzig for a week on the scroll, and they transcribed it. And one of the remarks that they talked about was that it used interpuncts. So again, nobody had seen that on leather, so they just said the forger just copied the Moabite stone. He's expecting to make something that looks ancient. And this is what something ancient would be. We know this is not everybody thought it was real. And what's interesting that is not every word is separated by an interpunct in the Moses scroll, in the Shapira's manuscript strips. They do appear throughout the manuscript, but between the words on the 10 commandments, I'm using the Aseret HaDevarim, the 10 words, they occur in the manuscript. And between every word is an interpunct. Now, here's what's interesting. Again, 1880s, they said this is fake. But Emmanuel Tove is the man on the planet for text criticism of the Hebrew Bible. And not only do we have his work, but we have Matthew Rochelle. We have other scholars who are working specifically on this question. And what we now know is that there are 12, well, some people argue for a couple more, but let me just say on the record, there are at least 12 documents among the, say, 1,000 manuscripts that were found at Qumran, 250 representing, there are 250 biblical texts, roughly, give or take, represented in that cache of 1,000, so roughly a fourth. And of those 250, 12 are written in Paleo-Hebrew. All 12 can be attributed, according to Emmanuel Tove and Ulrich and a couple of these other scholars who deal specifically with this question, are attributed to Moses. In other words, they're Torah text. They're texts that would be attributed by tradition to Moses. And so I find that to be striking. The fact that the physical characteristics of a scroll found in 1883 are almost identical to what we found when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. Now, could that be a forgery? People often ask me, is there any chance that this is a forgery? And I said, look, we have to find it. I am big on letting academia run its course. Can I say for certain that there is a Moses? Can I say for certain that if there is a Moses, that he is literate? Can I say look, this is the world I work in. I love the Bible. I believe that an ancient manuscript looks a certain way. And in 1865 to 1883, no one knew what that was. But man, in 1946, the whole world opened up to a whole new question. And you know what some of these scholars did? The brave ones, the ones who had the courage to step up and stand up and say, I want to look at that, the most brilliant in my mind, they said, hey, you know what this story reminds me of? It reminds me of the Shapira story. Maybe we should go look at that scroll again. Where is it? And everybody starts looking. Menachem Mansour is the guy who really kind of plows the way. What we do know is that they disappeared. Now, this is not the end of the story. Don't cry. Keep your chin up, because I'm working with a team, and a team of very reputable scholars and researchers and good friends who are willing to dig deep in this. We've been to England, we've been to Germany, we've been to Israel, we've been to Jordan, we've been back to Germany, we've been back to England, and we're going again. And we have some very solid leads. What we know is that after the death of Shapira, the scrolls, 15 of the 16 strips ended up in one place, and another piece ended up somewhere else. And I talk about that in the book. Could we find it? Because all we need is to find just a little bit of it. So one of the criticisms that I get is this. Without the scroll, you can't prove it. It's like a murder case without the body, and there is truth in that. I get that. But don't say we don't have the text. What we have is we don't have the manuscript itself, and we're looking for it. And don't think this isn't a needle in a haystack. I'm telling you, we are hot on the trail. But what we do have is the text. And here's what when I wrote my book, and it was published in February of 21, we had a transcript that was produced the first week of July 1883 by Edward Meyer and Herman Goethe. We had their transcription. It's published. And so I had that. And then separately, because they didn't work together, I had the same text from someone named Christian David Ginsburg. Christian David Ginsburg is one of the top scholars in the world in terms of Masoretic studies. You know, he's a Hebrew scholar, and he transcribed it as well. So what I did in my book was I put those two together because I wanted an eclectic text, because there were places where one scholar, the Germans, let's say, saw a certain letter and Ginsburg saw something else. So I noted all the variations. Now, what I didn't have at the time, and what Edan found the real value in his book, and that's helped me tremendously in my own studies, is that Edan found in a German document, it was a collection of manuscript entries by Shapira himself. His wife passed this book, collection of papers, to a scholar by the name of Strock, you know the name, I mentioned him earlier, who passed it to Steinschneider. And in that book, a listing of old manuscripts, Edan Dershowitz, eagle eye, noticed 3 pages that turned out to be the text, or part of a transcription of the text of the Shapira manuscript. So he put a critical edition in his book that had all of those. And by the way, if you study Hebrew, the Hebrew transcription, mine is in my book. Edan has one, and then on my academia page, I've got line by line the 19th century scholars and every letter that they saw in every location. So Jacob, I'll just say, the hunt is on, man. I do believe that according to the biblical writers, Moses did write a Torah. It's not the Pentateuch. I think the writers have memories of that, and I think that the book went missing very early. And so the text of the Bible give us certain clues that point to a document that if you found the document that these writers tend to know, it's going to be a document that looks very, very similar to what is found in those 16 leather strips. And Jeremiah is preaching from something that looks more like that than the Pentateuch. One more point on the ancient world's Torah of Moses. In the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, one of the things that Ezra and Nehemiah tell us is that when they came back, they read from the Torah of Moses, and it took from morning until midday. And if you tried to read the Torah, the Pentateuch, even if you're skilled at reading Hebrew and you read through the whole book, you're looking at 20 hours maybe. So it seems like it's more of a smallish book. And I propose to your viewers, if I might be so bold, to suggest that if we find this document and we test it, I think we're going to prove that it is, I'll say this, ancient and authentic. I do not claim that Shapira possessed, so I want to make sure nobody thinks this. I don't claim that manuscript, those manuscript strips, represent the scroll that Moses actually wrote. That's not what I say. It's not what I say in the book. It's not what I'm saying now. But I do believe that, because, by the way, in that cave they found 2 manuscript copies of the same document, 2 copies of the same. And according to Gutta and Ginsburg, they were basically the same all the way through, maybe a slight variation here or there, which I've got listed in my book. But fascinating stuff. And I think that if we find this and we test it, I think it's going to be ancient and authentic. How ancient? I don't know. But what if it is a copy of a copy and takes us closer to what is the original form of Deuteronomy? And everybody calls it a Deuteronomy. Jacob, I know you and I have had some conversation. It's got some texts which are more close to what we see in the book of Numbers, and there's a little bit of Exodus in there if you want to think of it that way. But there's no way, I'll just say this, there's no way a forger in the 19th century, I can't see of a way, I can see how they can make a forgery. But to make it look like something and smell like something that isn't going to be known to the world for another 65 to 80 years? Come on. That's preposterous. You talk about preposterous. So now we know, Jacob, that leather manuscripts can survive in a cave not far from the Dead Sea. And that if you find them, I often think, what if this manuscript, what if the Bedouin hadn't have found this in 1865, but what if they would have found it in 1949, 1950? Be a whole different story, wouldn't it? Now, I know that there are fake Dead Sea Scrolls that come up now, but see, a forger today, first you got to be good because you have crackerjack scholars. Some I know are on this program tonight that would bust you. They'd catch you. But see, they didn't have that. They didn't have the template to fake it then. So I agree with the detractors who say, well, when you find the scroll, I want you to do carbon dating. We're going to do that. We're going to test the ink. We're going to test the manuscript. We're going to look at everything about this scientifically. So, and again, don't think it's a needle in a haystack, because it's more like a pitchfork in a haystack right now. We've got some pretty good clues. Jacob, I know I just ran on and on. I get excited about it. I don't get out much, and so I get excited talking about this. Did I leave anything out you wanted to hit me with?
Oh, I don't think you left anything out at all. In fact, instead, I'm going to take a couple of super chat questions. I've been waiting a while.
All right.
Evergreen, thank you for your super chat. Dr. Kip says Shapira's reputation is suspect, which puts everything in doubt. Unknown forgeries that Shapira made. Response?
Absolutely. Dr. Kip, not only I know of Dr. Kip's work, and I would consider him someone that is in the know, and particularly when it comes to Dead Sea Scrolls, and even more particular when it comes to forgeries. What I would do is say the following. There are quite a few articles out there, academic articles that are really well done, that do mention some of Shapira's shady background, some of his forgeries in the past. The biggest one, not the only one, by the way, has to do with what we call the Moabitica. On the heels, really, very quickly, on the heels of the August 19th, 1868 discovery of the Moabite stone, the Mesha Stela, all of a sudden, some terracotta, some of them are quite ugly and nasty, start showing up in Shapira's shop. And so ultimately, the Prussians bought from Shapira roughly 1,700 of these ugly, nasty Moabite pieces for quite a bit of money, and Shapira made a hell of a lot of money off of this. And so by 1876, this whole thing is done. Now, Shapira was not ultimately, he wasn't fingered on the forgery part there, but he was associated with it, meaning the accusation, and most of the records say that his main man, his right-hand man, Salim al-Qari, was the one who made all these ugly little nasty things through other Arabs that were working with him. And so ultimately, that case was wrapped up in 1876. The story, the official word is that Shapira was the first dupe in the case. Now, what most people don't know, and I'm working on this book right now, I'm calling it tentatively, I'm referring it to as basically the Moabitica scandal. And what I have found, a couple of things that I've found in the reports, both the German reports and the English reports, if you dig in, you get everything from the Palestine Exploration Fund. You look at this in very, very good depth. What you'll see is that there are, initially, there quite possibly some of these were authentic. Now, we still have to test them. There are two scholars who are presently testing some of those Moabitica items. We still have some scattered throughout the world. I've found several in Germany and England and in the land of Israel. We've found several of them already. The goal is to get them tested, but scholars by the name of Gorin and Gorin, they're both working on an article, as I understand it, to come out in the PEF journal, I don't know when, but I'm looking forward to reading that. Now, I hope that they tested more than the 3 that are in the possession of the PEF. I've seen those. I think those are clearly fake. But what we do know is that, one more point on this, is that Shapira, on August the 6th, 1883, he wrote a note to Ginsburg. And he tells Ginsburg, because in the paper, in the Jewish Chronicle of August the 4th, 1883, the writer had said, hey, you know, you got to watch this Shapira guy. He's the same guy that tried to, remember, he was involved in that Moabitica scandal. So Shapira, August the 6th, from the Cannon Hotel, sat down and he wrote a letter. He said, hang on, this sad news of the Moabitica is hitting again. Let me set the record straight. And he said, now you go check me on this. This is in the book as well. He said, when I first took the batch to Germany, that first batch I felt was authentic. The latter batches I felt were inauthentic, that they had been forged. And he said, and I told those Germans, don't buy these, and they told me, just keep bringing them. So now, the reputation of Shapira is something funny. Some of your viewers know the Dead Sea Scroll scholar James Charlesworth, and you know James Tabor. James Tabor and I were in Israel a couple of years ago, and at Ben Gurion, we ran into James Charlesworth. And Charlesworth comes up to me and James. We're standing there together at that, you know, at the welcome hall that you arrive at Ben Gurion, and he says, "You know this is real, don't you? You know that the Shapira strips are real." And I said, "Well, I kind of feel like that." He said, "Oh yeah." He said, "Let me tell you." He said, Shapira was involved in some forgeries, just like Dr. Kip Davis said. Shapira was clearly involved in some forgeries, and he said, you know what, the thing about those forgeries, they're bad. They're really, really bad, and they're obviously forged. He said, but this manuscript is different. Now, I think most people would agree. You may not agree with everything that Dr. Charlesworth comes up with, but this is just a couple of years ago, and you can look him up, Dr. James Charlesworth at Princeton. In fact, on my website, rossknichols.com, I have it's on themosesscroll.com. I have a blog post where I tell the story of meeting with Charlesworth. And Charlesworth wrote a letter to his friends encouraging them to get the book, The Moses Scroll, because it addressed some of these things. But in that letter, he also mentioned the thing about Shapira. So one final point for your super chat, Jacob, and thanks for that, by the way. I appreciate that. But in the whenever the scholars will say that it's fake, and they refer back to other reasons that other scholars have said they're fake, I would encourage those gifted minds of today to go in and study this. I'll give you an example. On my book cover, there's a statement from a letter that Moses Shapira wrote to Edward Augustus Bond. The sin of believing in a false document is not much greater than disbelieving the truth. The tendency of showing great scholarship by detecting a forgery is rather great in our age. And Jacob, that is still the case. Many people today say 1883 they said it was a forgery. Ross, sorry buddy, it's still a forgery. And I say, hey, hold on. They didn't know a few key points, like scrolls can survive. Sometimes there are leather scrolls written in Paleo-Hebrew, but only if it's a work attributed to Moses. Sometimes word separating dots appear in a manuscript, but get this, Jacob, they only appear on Paleo manuscripts. You look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, you're not going to find word separating dots in texts that are written in Aramaic script, or the square Hebrew script as we call it. You're not going to find them. Word separating dots are only found in Paleo documents, and isn't that odd? Now, do you think if Shapira's a forger, he's not only a forger, but he's a clairvoyant of some kind? I mean, come on. So hopefully that answered the question. Good question, by the way. What else you got?
We got Mr. Warlight. Thank you for your super chat. Can Ross turn a wooden staff into a cobra snake?
I tell you what, Mr. Wright, I think that I've never tried that before, and I am deathly afraid of snakes. So if I could, I wouldn't. And not even for a super chat. Thanks for your generosity to my brother, but I would not. I wouldn't even try it. I don't like snakes. My wife could probably do that for you if there's a trick involved.
Evergreen, thank you for another super chat. Why doesn't it call the Hebrew deity?
Another excellent question, Evergreen. Let me say this. There are a couple of points. In the manuscript, we have two occurrences of the Tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He. We have it in the opening line and we have it in the closing line. And what I believe is that the core piece of the document, say from right after that opening passage, which uses Al Pi Yehovah or Al Pi Yod He Vav He, according to the word of God, of Jehovah, after that, it only uses Elohim. So, for instance, this manuscript, again, it's in the book. The manuscript is in the book, in Hebrew and my English translation. It says, people know the Shema. Shema Yisrael Adonai, Tetragrammaton. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. In this manuscript, an example of this would be Shema Yisrael Elohim. Our Elohim is Echad. God, our God. Elohim, our Elohim is one. Now, this was a puzzle, and it was even a puzzle to Shapira. Just a lot of people don't know this. Again, people are going off of evidence from the 1800s, and some of these scholars have not yet dug into the material. They're behind. Modern scholarship is behind on this, and I don't blame them. They're going to be that way until my friends and I find the real scroll and we start testing it. Then they're all going to want to talk to us, and we're going to be too dadgum busy. But what Shapira also did, he published, and I put it out on all over the web and in my book, he put pros and cons. And one of the things he said was, he goes, something I don't get. Why is just like Evergreen says, why is the divine name only used in the opening line and the closing line? Why does it use Elohim for the rest of the document? And here's what he came up with. The first thing he asked a further question. He said, could it be, is it possible that east of the Jordan we have a group who is not familiar with the name who produced the bulk of the manuscript. In other words, there are in 2 manuscript copies, each consisting of roughly 21 columns of text, and each column is about the size of a poster card. Which, by the way, that was something else. They said, this scroll was just cut off the bottom of a scroll. Remind me about that, and I'll come back to it. But the bottom line is, it's like everything about this, he ultimately said, look, maybe this is an Elohist document. So he had become familiar through Bleek's work, published in 1860, that scholarship was beginning to suggest that before the name, I'm just going to say Jehovah, use the English, and I know people can get in fistfights over the name. Please, I don't want to go that far with it. But bear with me. People believe that before the name Jehovah came into, popularity among the Israelites, that God was just referred to as Elohim or some form of El. And we do have evidence of this, interestingly enough, from the pages of the Bible. All right, and let me hit this real quickly. So if you look at Exodus chapter 6, Moses he's talking to God. And according to the text, Exodus 6:2 and 6:3, God says, by my name, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, I was not known to the fathers, meaning Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but by my name, El Shaddai. Now, that causes a problem. This is what I love. See, I love these biblical problems. It causes a problem because you and I would say, hang on just a minute. All the way back in Genesis 4, it says, then men began to call upon the name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. So, and hundreds of times between Genesis chapter 2, verse 3 is the first time the divine name occurs, and it appears hundreds of times up to Exodus chapter 6 and verse 2 and 3. So what do you do with that? Well, modern scholarship says those texts have probably been edited by a redactor, typically a redactor of J and E, someone who's taking, again, I'm using the terms that are popular, or many scholars talk about this in the documentary hypothesis, that you have J, the text J, and these are built, Wellhausen and Graf and some of these others came up with the designations, longer story than I can get into tonight. But so J would have told a story and used the name Jehovah, because that's a Jehovah text. E, the writer of E, would have used Elohim. And so a redactor later who says, both these stories are good, I don't know what he said, but just bear with me, said, I want to keep both of them. So I got to smooth this out. So the first 32 occurrences of a name for deity or a title for deity in the Hebrew Bible, Genesis 1:1 through chapter 2, verse 2, Elohim is used exclusively. Elohim, 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 all the way through. It's the only name used 32 times. Then you get to chapter 2, verse 3, and all of a sudden it says Jehovah Elohim. And what scholarship believes is that it's where you put the pieces together. An editor, a brilliant editor, if you want to be kind of fundamentalist here, go ahead. Just say a divine redactor said, okay, I got a text that says Jehovah. I got a text that says Elohim. I'm just going to say Jehovah God or Yehovah Elohim. But again, the question was, how do we have this document that doesn't use the divine name, the Tetragrammaton? An interesting side point to Evergreen's question is that in the 19th century, in 1883, a scholar by the name of Neubauer said that Elohim thing was one of the most brilliant things the forger did. Like he's like, boy, he almost got us on that one. That was a sweet trick there. But I tend to think that we could have, in this document, we very well could have an ancient and authentic document that employed only, that the original document that was copied and copied perhaps and put in a cave in the upper part of the Wadi Mujib, that manuscript was written originally. The earliest copies only had Elohim. And then the scribe adds sort of an intro and an exit, if you will, or an intro and a closing, and put the name Jehovah. But here's the other thing about this manuscript. It doesn't have many of the mistakes, if you will, or discrepancies that the canonical text has. Now, if people are fundamentalists, they say, how dare you? In fact, that's what they said in the 1800s. How dare you suggest that there are mistakes? Well, there are. I'm serious. There really are. So what we have to do is we have to have answers for that. We have to dig deep. We have to do critical historical studies. Why is it that Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 both presented as the 10 words that were spoken from the mouth of God on the mountain, from the midst of the fire on the day of assembly? Why don't they agree? Now, I know the fundamentalist answer, but why don't they? Why do we have the Masoretic text, which reads a certain way in certain verses, and we have the Septuagint reads differently, and the Samaritan Pentateuch, and then we have all these wonderful Dead Sea Scroll biblical manuscripts that we have now? They have different readings. Like if my Hebrew Bible is I'll start to get it. It's a BHS, Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. And it's a long name. It's the the German Publication Society. Anyone who studies biblical Hebrew, who loves the Bible, is going to get one of these. And what you'll find is that you open to any page in the Bible, pick a page, any page, close your eyes, open it up, point, put your finger in it and look down. You're going to see variations, textual differences. So which one is what do we do? Well, there is a process. It's not just a matter of picking and choosing. There is a very disciplined approach to say, hey, what do we know here? First of all, again, like I've done tonight, I've tried to be honest to the text. I have a saying I tell those who are willing to study with me every week. By the way, thank God for people like you who take the time to listen to me rant and rave. My wife won't do it, so you will, and I appreciate that. But when I look at these textual differences, it excites me, and as I've tried to do, I'm being honest with the text. Like if people say, well, you're taking liberties with the text, you're a liberal theologian, you're a liberal independent scholar. How dare you? I'm being conservative. I'm the one who says the Bible says this. Let's at least give it a fair shake. Now, the sad thing is that many of the new scholars, I read a lot of books that are written by scholars today, and I can almost say that I prefer, and no offense to any of the scholars today, because if you've got a book, I'll read it too. But I promise you that my favorite books are written by the scholars in the 19th century. I find quite often that they were bold and brave, and it was charting ground that others hadn't already decided on. And I think a lot of times today's academic world has been spoon-fed the answers that they think they have to give. And they're scared to death to challenge what other scholars have said. Maybe they're not confident enough. I don't know what the reason is, but I say get a little bit of a backbone and consider. Look at it. Is there a possibility? I, for the life of me, cannot believe that a true biblical scholar couldn't look at this material and say, well, that is some pretty good evidence. The preponderance of evidence may not prove that this manuscript, the 16 leather strips, were authentic, but the preponderance of evidence is certainly against it being a forgery. And I challenge people to challenge that. Like Edon Dershowitz has told me before, a lot of people have written counters to this or that, but a lot of the evidence has yet to be challenged back effectively. Like really point by point. It's like they're talking past one another. Edon has written an academic book that has proposed some very challenging things. I get that. But rather than address the things that Edon has put forward as evidence in favor of the authenticity of the manuscript, they just pick other stuff and go at it. I'm saying, go look at the piece in Shapira's book. If you're a high scholar, very intellectual, you want to be stimulated, take the part of the book that was written by Naama Patel, I think is her name, a scholar that worked with Edon, to put together this very academic approach to the text. Look at that. Look at some of the stuff that Benjamin Sass has written. Take the time to give it a fair shake. And it's easy to take something that has been already declared a forgery and stand up and say, it may not be. But don't just decide on a forgery because someone else did. You be a big good scholar. Go do it yourself, and then disprove it. So I think that's real important. One thing I think is interesting, and Dr. Kipp brought up the reputation of Shapira. That, believe me, that is one of the biggest things that really goes against Shapira. And it's why, for instance, Jacob, as I recall, you and I did a show together on the Salom inscription. Nobody knows this. Well, they do now, because I was invited to the Albright Institute in Jerusalem, and I gave a lecture on, it was a Conrad Schick conference in Jerusalem at the Albright. And I was invited to come. I wrote an abstract, and I said, because I thought people don't know this, you talk about the Salom inscription. Salom inscription is found in the south end of the tunnel that is in the city of David, that winds underneath, circuit, it's just back and forth like a snake, and it has an inscription on it. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that, like, if you go there today and you go on tour with me, TanakhTours.com, we're not scheduling any right this minute, but when we do, I want you to come with me. I'll take you through that tunnel. And when we go through that tunnel, you'll see signs and you'll read pamphlets, when you get in line. And it's going to say that this inscription, it's 6 lines long, and it says that 2 teams of workers began to work their way, and they met in the middle. And we all know that now. But what people don't know is that the person who first deciphered it was Moses Shapira. This is not something I made up. This is straight truth. This is like the gospel. I'm telling you, this is Shapira gospel stuff. And the 4th line down, I started to say 4th, maybe it's the 5th. I'm not looking at it. There's a reference to 1,200 cubits, 200 and 1,000 cubits. Shapira, in July of 1883, in a paper called the Athenaeum, July the 16th, I think, wrote a paper for the paper, and he said, I see this as 1,200 cubits. And all the scholars of the day said, oh, Shapira, stick with selling souvenirs, son. Let the big boys do all the high academic stuff. That's basically really what they said. And but you know what? I'll be damned if Shapira wasn't right. He was right. He was right. He was the first one to interpret what that means, what the inscription meant, and he was the first one to say 1,200 cubits, and everybody accused him of being stupid and wrong. Well, guess what? He wasn't. So I went to the Albright, I gave that lecture, and a Professor Ronnie Reich, who was over my section, is going to publish in his forthcoming book that information. And it's not published yet, but I wrote the paper up, and it's supposed to be published in IEJ, the Israel Exploration Journal. So, but in the meantime, you can find on Jacob's channel. By the way, if you're here because of me and you hadn't subscribed to Jacob's channel, History Valley, do it now. Hit the subscribe, because you're going to find some good stuff on this channel. But one good thing I can tell you can look at, Jacob, I think we did one on the Salom inscription, so they can look at that and check that out. What else you got? You got some more questions?
Yep, and I just want to say thank you for what you said. I appreciate that, Ross. Yeah, I want to take this one. Kip Davis says here, it's probably just Deuteronomy 32. Actually, that's not the one I was intending to pick. It's this one. Hilkiah says he found the book of the Torah. Moses is not mentioned in this story.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. As you would expect from Dr. Kip Davis. What I found, and maybe we can correspond a little bit offline on this too. What we see, and I'm preaching to the choir here with Dr. Davis, but if you look at in the biblical text, in the Tanakh, passages which are clearly referring to that book, okay, if I can call it that book, the Sefer, the little Sefer, the one that Moses wrote, it's referred to as Sefer HaTorah, and all 10 of those references point me not to ideas, laws, verbiage, vocabulary that's found in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, but only in Deuteronomy. Sefer HaTorah, that phrase. If you look at Sefer Moshe, which is 8 times, and this has been a while since I did the research, but it's in the book, and I'll go back and make sure. But as I recall, those 8 occurrences of Sefer Moshe, which he's saying this story does not say Moses, but it says Book of the Torah. Now, something just hit me. This is like, as a fundamentalist Christian, I would say something just dropped in my spirit, but something dropped in my head at the very least. If I look at the text side by side, Dr. Kip is right, almost. He says, Hilkiah says he found the book of the Torah. Moses is not mentioned in this story. Well, that depends. Depends on what, Ross? I'm glad you asked. If you look at what I call horizontal reading and you put 2 Kings 22-23 side by side with 2 Chronicles 34-35, you find something quite interesting. And that interesting thing that you find is that Moses is, in fact, mentioned in the story. It just depends on which account you read. And so let me point this out, because I want to make sure that people have it in their notes after they see this comment. If you look at 2 Chronicles 34, verse 14, it says the following. While they were bringing out the money that had been brought into the house of the Lord, Hilkiah the priest found the book of the law of the Lord given through Moses. So it does have Moses in the story. So just so you don't go away from here thinking it doesn't, and by the way, the next passage down agrees with 2 Kings 22, which does not mention Moses. There it says, Hilkiah said to Shaphan the secretary, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. No mention of Moses. But the implication, at least here's the way I would view that, and maybe this is something that Dr. Kip would agree, I don't know, but we tend to think that Chronicles is edited more heavily interpolated, maybe brought up to speed or so forth. So maybe that's why it has one and the other doesn't. But let me let me look down one more text. Anyway, I don't know if Moses is mentioned later, but the implication is that is something that Moses Moses is mentioned. So, and clearly, I don't know if his other note that you flashed up there momentarily about Deuteronomy 32, it is interesting what happens with Huldah is Huldah has in mind something pretty tough that's coming. But remember, Huldah says, she talks about these curses that are coming. I always like to point out that one thing that Huldah got wrong, and I find it interesting that it's still in the account, is that she says to tell the guy who sent you, tell the king that he's going to go to his grave in peace. That all this bad stuff that he heard, the blessings and the curses, and so the curses, I'm sure, just let him know that he's going to go to his grave in peace. And instead, he dies in 609 BCE at Megiddo with a shot of an arrow. Well, it depends. If you read Kings and Chronicles side by side, in one account, he dies on the battlefield at Megiddo, and in the other account, he doesn't die. He's brought back to Jerusalem and dies there. Either way, arrow takes him out. So what is it that the king hears that causes him to tear his garments? It sounds like it's bad. I mean, it sounds like it's curses. Interestingly enough, this manuscript that I'm referring to as the Moses Scroll has some very interesting things. It has sort of a travel itinerary. It tells some of the journey of the children of Israel. It has almost immediately after that, you've been at this mountain long enough, get up and go and take possession and so forth. I'm paraphrasing. And then it gets to Mount Horeb, like Deuteronomy, and unlike Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, it refers to that sacred mountain as Horeb and not Sinai, but it begins there, and then they get there, and then you get laws, basically. You have a little bit of narrative. You have the 10 words and blessings and curses. And it ends, the manuscript basically ends with the ceremony of the blessings and the curses. Now, here's something that I want to leave your viewers with because I really want them to read the story and get the fullness of how powerful this manuscript is. Because you want to be in the know. When we find this manuscript and test it and it's proven authentic, I'm telling you, my phone's going to be blowing up and I'm going to turn the ringer off because you didn't listen now. It's like the doors of the ark are going to be closed. But whenever you look at this, it ends with the curses, just like you would expect that you would tear your garments when you heard that. Now here's something else. If you read Deuteronomy 27 and 28, you find something that's quite interesting. First of all, Deuteronomy 11, and by the way, tomorrow night, I'm going to be live on Ross K. Nichols TV talking with my friend Jono about this blessing and curse ceremony that took place at Eval and Gerizim. We're going to talk about the location of Gilgal. We're going to get into all kind of fun stuff. But the ceremony, Moses begins, according to the book of Deuteronomy, and towards the end of chapter 11, Moses is telling them, look, when you cross into the land, you're going to do this ceremony, paraphrasing, you're going to put these tribes on Gerizim for the blessing, these tribes on Eval for the curse, and you're going to do this. And then it's like he interrupts himself. Moses says, hang on. Now I'm going to talk to you about all these laws. Between chapter 12 and chapter 26 of Deuteronomy, you get more than 100 laws. Scholars refer to this as the law code. Many scholars in the 19th century and some scholars today still think that this is the oldest part of Deuteronomy. I say to you, you've heard them of old say that. I say unto you, that's the newest part. It interrupts Moses. Chapter 12 through 26 is smashed in what I call interrupting Moses. Deuteronomy 11, you have to stop learning about what you're going to do when you cross in the line. Then you go through 100 some odd laws. however many chapters that is from 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, all the way to 26. You get to 27, it's like Moses says, oh yeah. Anyway, like I was saying, when you cross into the land, you're going to do this ceremony. Now here's something strange. In chapter 27 of Deuteronomy, he says, like I was saying way back in chapter 11 before I interrupted myself, when you get into the land, you're going to do this ceremony, and you're going to do the blessings on Mount Gerizim and the curses on Mount Ebal. And he says, and here's the ceremony. And then it gives the curses, but it doesn't give the blessings. Now, I know people go, yes it does. They're in chapter 28. No, they're not. I've written an article to show that. What you have, what we call, Jonah and I have called this the blessed bees and the cursed bees. You don't have the blessed bees, and the rabbis point this out in the Talmud. They recognize this. But that's for tomorrow night, Jacob. I'm sorry. I want to save something fun to talk about tomorrow. But I do think, hopefully this addresses a little bit of Kip's question. He can clarify, and I'm sure he will. He certainly can write me offline if he wants to. But I think that Huldah is at least what's being put into Huldah's response has something to do with the curses, maybe something like that.
So I'll take this super chat question real quick, then we'll close.
Yep.
Mr. Rorlight, thank you for another super chat. Have you heard of the 13th century military commander under Ramses II named Moses? And could Moses be based on this popular Egyptian history figure?
It's an interesting question, Mr. Warlight. Let me answer it this way. We get in Exodus chapter 3 what we would refer to as sort of a religious explanation of the name Moses. Exodus chapter 2, I'm sorry. So the daughter of Pharaoh goes down to the water. She sees the basket with this good-looking little baby in there. I love babies. She loved babies. She hears the baby. He's a goodly child, and she gets him out of the water, and she says, I'm going to name him Moshe because I drew him out of the water. And so it's a play on the words. You know what I mean, play. It would be better in English. I heard Richard Elliott Freeman say this. In English, you shouldn't call him Moses. Moses is the transliteration of the name in the text. You should call him Drew. Why would you call him Drew? Because the writer wants you to get a play on the word. I'm going to call him Drew because I drew him out of water, you see. So, but the writer of Exodus wants us to think that Moshe is a Hebrew name. But I got a secret for you. It's not. It's actually an Egyptian name. And it makes more sense in the story if we understand that the Pharaoh's daughter is referring to an Egyptian name. And here's how I know that. If you look at Egyptian names that we know from history, there is, have you ever heard of King Tut? You know, the song King Tut, you know.
Yeah.
Tut's name is Tutmose. Tutmose. We have Akmose. We have all of these different names because what Mose, and I'm not an expert in Egyptian, but I've read this from experts in Egyptian, and the forms of that name, Mose, it's really a Egyptian name, and it means son of. So this is me extrapolating and pulling this information together. So if you say, what's this guy's name? You say, that's King Tut, Tutmose, because he is the son of Mose. Ah, okay. Or I'm sorry, he's the son of Tut. So we just call him Tut for short. Well, they didn't call him Tut in his day, I doubt. I bet he got the full name, Tutmose, Akmose, or whatever Warlight had the example. But what we do know is that this Mose means son of. So could it be that the original story there, because the writer is preserving a story that's been handed down, maybe orally first, maybe in a earlier form of writing, that ultimately this name comes down, but maybe there's something there, like the Egyptian play is even better, because the Pharaoh's daughter doesn't know who the daddy is. Who's the baby's daddy? We don't know. We just found the baby in the Nile. So we'll call him, listen, watch this, silent Mose. We'll call him Mose. You go, Mose? Like, what's the first part? Nothing. So there are various theories. One of my friends, some of you know Simcha Yakubovich, if I remember right, one of the things that he puts in, I think it's Exodus Decoded, is he makes a connection between our Moses, the biblical Moses, and a person at that time named Akmose. And in Hebrew, at least, so this is kind of a mixing of different languages, which is fun to do. I don't know how accurate it is, but Ak in Hebrew, the idea is that it's the brother of Moses. But I don't know how much fluidity there was between Semitic language or Hebrew language and Egyptian language. We see some of that in another context. But hopefully that has answered that question sufficiently. Did I miss any more, Jacob?
Not at all. And I want to thank you for joining me tonight, Ross Nichols.
Hey, man, it's always a pleasure, Jacob. And we've had conversations offline, and I think you're a great guy. I think what you're doing is wonderful, bringing good content to a large audience. And my son and I work together here. It's a small operation, but man, look, we welcome this whole group. If you would, some of your viewers might want to join us. Every week we do, just kind of give them a little bit of what we do. On Saturdays, we're either doing a live stream at 10:30 a.m. Central Time, or we're streaming a premiere that we've already filmed. We're currently in a series on the Pentateuch, working through according to the annual cycle of readings. On Thursday nights, we do a really fun deal at 8 p.m. Central, and people might want to check that out. And then we're working on some things that I can't talk about, and I can't talk about them, like, honestly. Not like somebody's going to beat me up if I do, but I've kind of promised not to. But some exciting stuff is coming. And we're also working on a Northern Prophet series. It's going to be a while. We're doing a lot of stuff on that. But man, I hope that there's been some cross. I hope that some people from my channel have joined yours, because I scrolled through. I can't keep up with you, man. You've got so many outstanding interviews. And so hopefully they've subscribed on your channel, and maybe people on yours will join me. We welcome you.
Thank you very much, Ross. And yes, I would like everybody to go over there to Ross K Nichols TV and subscribe to his channel. And also, if you don't already have the book, go get it. The Moses Scroll. The History Valley Amazon affiliate link will be in the description below, and Ross K Nichols TV will be tagged in the description below when the stream is over. So you can go over to his channel and subscribe.
What are we going to talk about next, Jacob? What do you want to talk about next? We got to book another date, man. This is fun.
Yeah.
We'll talk about it offline, and we'll surprise everybody.
Yeah, that sounds good. And that being said, I want to thank everybody for watching tonight and the super chats. And thanks again, Ross.
Hey, my brother, thank you, and God bless. Have a beautiful evening. And I look forward to seeing some of y'all Thursday night.
You too, Ross. Thank you.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.